The snow fell like a slow collapse of heaven, each flake soft but relentless, silencing the world in white. On the edge of that silence stood Clara May Holloway, her boots swallowed by the drifts, her breath a ghost in the brittle air. Winter had a way of drawing out the grief that summer let sleep. Out here, far from the town's chapel, bells and crooked fences, she could pretend that silence wasn't loneliness, just stillness, just peace. Her cabin crouched against the tree line like it didn't belong, just as the townfolk said about her. Widow Holloway, they whispered, who talks to birds and lives without a man. The seamstress, Mrs. Talbot, liked to say Clara had gone odd since the war took her husband. A cavalryman buried beneath foreign soil and ceremony, odd for planting herbs like a Comanche, odd for building her own fences, fixing her own roof, wearing her dead husband's coat like it still had warmth to give. But Clara didn't waste herself worrying about them. Winter made survival a full-time prayer. She carried her axe that morning, the kind with a smooth worn handle and a blade sharp enough to part wood like it was sorrow. Behind her, her mule breathed steam. She kept close to the ravine, where wind wasn't so vicious and the pine wood hadn't yet been claimed. The snow came down hard, fat flakes that buried footprints before they could be missed. That suited her. The wind shifted. She paused. It was a sound so thin it could have been imagination. A wail, maybe, or wind through dead grass. But her body went still, listening the way animals do. Then dash again, a cry, faint, too soft to be a coyote, too broken to be bird, something living, something small. She dropped the axe and moved fast, the snow near her knees. Her heart quickened with fear, but with a strange sort of urgency, like a dream she'd forgotten and suddenly remembered mattered. She followed the sound across a frozen creek bed, through a thicket of bare brambles, and then she saw it, at the base of a crumpled cedar tree, half covered in snow and wrapped in a thin deer hide, was a baby, an infant, barely months old. Blue around the lips, eyes slitted open, crying now, soft and desperate, arms twitching under the weight of snow. Clara fell to her knees. She didn't think. She didn't count risks or imagine what the town would say. She did what her body knew to do. She pulled the baby to her chest, unbuttoned her coat, and slid him beneath, pressing his tiny body against her own. Her skin burned from the cold, but she didn't care. "Hush, now," she murmured, rocking gently. "I've got you, little one." The baby's skin was darker than hers, his hair thick and raven black. Comanche. That fact would matter to some. To Clara, it didn't. The mule whinnied as she returned, cradling the child beneath her coat. She rode home through the storm, leaning low, singing softly into the wind. The fire at her cabin barely caught. Her hands shook. She stripped off her wet coat, then wrapped the baby in the last of her wool blankets and held him by the stove. Her own body ached with cold, but she stayed there for hours, skin to skin, warming the child back to life. She spooned boiled milk into his mouth, just enough. He coughed, choked, swallowed. She cried, then not loud, not weakly. Just tears that slid from her eyes without sound. He lived by morning. He was stronger, his eyes open and watching. He didn't cry anymore. He just looked at her. The next day she rode into town, baby swaddled close, tucked deep inside a sling. Beneath her shawl, she moved quietly through the general store, picking out goat's milk, cloth, dried meat. When she reached the counter, she kept her eyes on the goods. But Mrs. Talbot's eyes were already fixed on the bundle. "That yours?" the woman asked, voice clipped. Clara didn't answer. Mrs. Talbot leaned forward. "That's not a white child." "No," Clara said softly. The room chilled, despite the fire. "I heard you've been talking to shadows up there, Clara May," Mrs. Talbot said, half smiling. "Now you're bringing home one of theirs." Clara handed her the coins. He was alone. He would have died. "That wasn't your decision to make." Clara turned without another word and walked out. By sundown, The town was buzzing. Clara had taken in a Comanche baby. No one knew how, no one knew why. But the whispers spread like smoke on dry timber. Men muttered over whiskey that she was harboring danger. Women clutched their children tighter when she passed. Sheriff Griggs rode up to her cabin 2 days later, knocked twice before letting himself in. He stood at the threshold, hat in hand. "Miss Holloway." She looked up from the cradle she'd fashioned out of a drawer. "You've got everyone talking," he said. "I imagine I do. You found him out in the woods." She nodded. "Alone. Blood in the snow. No tracks after the storm. Whatever took the others, it didn't take him." The sheriff looked at the baby, now asleep, thumb curled against his cheek. "Do you know what happens when word spreads that Comanche young are being raised by settlers?" Clara's voice didn't change. "Then they'll come looking. And if they think we took him." She met his eyes. "Then they'll find him fed, warm, alive." Griggs exhaled, long and heavy. "You do what you think is right, Clara. But right and safe ain't always the same." He left without another word. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the fire with the child pressed to her chest, humming the same lullabies she used to whisper to the wind when grief kept her awake. She gave him no name, knowing that names should come from kin, but she spoke to him as though he could answer. "You weren't meant to be left," she told him. "You were meant to survive." On the third night, she felt eyes in the trees. She stepped outside, lantern held high, breath curling into the dark. The snow had stopped falling. A full moon cast silver across the frozen ground. She couldn't see him, but she knew someone was out there watching, waiting. She didn't speak, just stood a moment, then turned and walked back inside. The next morning, she found firewood stacked neatly by her door, pine, clean, cut. She hadn't chopped it. A second bundle arrived the next night. Then meat dried and wrapped in hide. Clara said nothing. Left a bowl of stew on a flat stone by the pine. By morning, it was gone. It continued for days, gifts exchanged without meeting. Each night, she stood by the window, holding the child, watching the tree line, and each night, a shadow stood farther than rifle reach, but near enough to see her face. She recognized the silhouette now, tall, wrapped in fur and buckskin, a hunter. Kin of the child. Kin, perhaps, of the blood in the snow. She wondered if he saw her as a thief or a savior. One evening, the fire had gone low. She was reaching for kindling when the mule whinnied, restless. She turned on. There he stood, on the edge of the yard, not hiding. She stepped outside, barefoot on the frozen plank porch. The child stirred in her arms, then stilled. He made no move, just watched. A breath of wind stirred his braids. His eyes were unreadable. Slowly, Clara unwrapped the sling and raised the baby for him to see. The man's eyes shifted sharp focus, then something softer. He stepped forward once, then stopped. She stayed rooted. Neither of them spoke. He reached to his belt and drew something, not a weapon, but a pouch. He placed it gently on the ground, then turned and melted into the trees. She waited until he was gone before picking it up. Inside, herbs, dried root, something sacred, a sign, not a threat, a trust. That night, she lit a second lantern and left it glowing by the window. A soft beacon, not a signal for help, but a promise. He is safe. You are seen. Come if you must. The baby slept soundly, curled against her chest, the beat of his heart echoing the rhythm of hers. She looked out at the tree line one last time before sleep, and whispered into the silence, "I won't let him die." The forest answered only with stillness, but in her bones, she felt it. She was no longer alone. The snow began to rot by mid-March, slush pooling in the hollows like old tears. Ice hung stubborn in the shadows, but the wind had changed, no longer bit, only whispered. Clara May Holloway stood on her porch, the baby in her arms, watching. The thaw undo winter's grip. Smoke from her chimney drifted thin and steady, her eyes fixed on the tree line. She hadn't seen the hunter since the night he left the medicine pouch, but she knew he hadn't gone far. Each day brought new signs. In the damp earth, meat left wrapped in bark, sinew cord woven and left in careful spirals by the doorstep. These were not threats. These were breadcrumbs of understanding, offerings, silent language, spoken without need for sound. The boy, she thought of him now as Little Feather. Not in ownership, but affection was stronger. His cries had faded to soft coos, his limbs gaining weight, his eyes sharp and watchful. She carried him in the sling while chopping wood, singing lullabies in the old mountain cadence her grandmother once sang. Words didn't matter. The rhythm did. One morning, a knock. Not the hesitant rapping of the sheriff or the mailman's polite tap. This was deliberate, slow. She opened the door, and there he stood, the Comanche hunter, the one whose gaze had passed through her in silence. This time, he stood closer on her porch, dusted with meltwater, no weapons drawn. His eyes were dark and deep, unreadable but not cold. He nodded once, a gesture not of greeting but of acknowledgement. She stepped aside. Inside, the baby stirred in his cradle. The man moved with the careful grace of a wild animal, quiet but utterly sure of his space. He knelt by the cradle and looked down. The boy blinked up, unafraid. The man reached out and placed 2 fingers on the baby's tiny chest, then closed his eyes. Clara stood behind him, unmoving, her hands at her sides. When he opened his eyes again, they were damp. "He is my brother's son," the man said, his voice low, thick with something more than sorrow. "My blood." Clara nodded. "Your brother?" she asked, already knowing. "Dead? His woman too?" "The snows took them. I followed their tracks too late." Silence settled between them. Outside, ice slid from the roof with a soft thud. "I buried them," Clara said. "What was left?" He nodded. "She fought. He died trying to protect them. But the boy, he lived. Because of you," the man said. Then, "I am no coney, Clara." They said no more, but something eased between them, like a tightened rope let loose. From that day, Nokoni came often, not always with words. He chopped wood without being asked, repaired a crooked hinge, hunted and left deer meat near the door. Clara never thanked him aloud, but she made extra food and left it where he might sit. He never stayed long, but he always came back. When the baby cried, Nokone would lift him without hesitation. The boy quieted in his arms, as if something ancestral passed between them, a scent, a rhythm, a blood-deep recognition. Nokani never smiled, but his eyes softened in the child's presence. Word traveled fast in the town. They saw Nokani once riding silently through the hills, then vanishing like smoke. Mrs. Talbot was the first to speak of it in the general store, loud enough for the men to hear. She called it a scandal, said Clara had taken up with the savage. By week's end, men with rifles were muttering at the saloon. Sheriff Griggs came again, this time with lines of worry carved deep in his face. "You're drawing eyes, Clara," he said, voice low. "Men are talking vigilante justice. They think you've lost your mind, that you've joined their side." She said nothing. "They want to take the child, say he ain't safe here, that he don't belong." Clara looked him square in the face. "He belongs to someone," she said, "and he's still breathing. That's more than they gave him." Griggs rubbed his jaw. "If they ride, I can't stop all of them." She closed the door without saying goodbye. That night, Clara sat by the fire, the baby in her lap, the rifle propped by the door. The cabin creaked with the changing season, wind rattling through places she hadn't noticed before. But it wasn't wind that raised her skin. It was footsteps. She stepped outside. 5 men on horseback, torches held high, flames snapping in the wind. Mrs. Talbot stood behind them, arms crossed, lips pressed thin as knives. "We're here for the child," one of the men said. "He don't belong here." Not with you. Not in this town. Clara stood firm, shawl wrapped tight, the baby in her arms. Then you'll have to kill me, she said, voice low but clear. Behind her, the cabin glowed warm. Inside, no. Bo leaned against the table. She didn't reach for it. A long silence. Then dash, hoofbeats. Fast, from the trees. No cone rode out like a storm, bareback, bow in hand but lowered. He stopped between her and the riders, back straight, eyes cold. He said nothing, just stared. The men shifted in their saddles. Uncertain now, Mrs. Talbot stepped forward. That child's kin to killers. No cone turned his head slowly toward her. Clara spoke. That child is alive because of his people's courage. And my choice. One of the riders spat. This ain't your war, widow. No, she said. It's yours. But I won't fight it. Sheriff Griggs appeared, then alone, on foot, coat flapping like wings. He walked between both parties and raised a hand. No one's dying tonight, he said. Back to your homes. A long moment passed. The riders turned, one by one, disgust on their faces. Mrs. Talbot lingered, burning Clara with her stare, before storming off. Only when they were gone did Clara exhale. No Coney dismounted, walked to her, stood close now, close enough she could smell the wood smoke on his hair. They will come again, he said. She nodded. Maybe. The snow is melting. It is. He looked at the boy. My people will come for him soon. His grandmother lives. She has the right. Clara swallowed. Her throat ached. He belongs to her, she said, though the words trembled on her tongue. You saved him, Nokoni replied. I just didn't let him die. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into the leather satchel slung across his chest and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft hide, tied with a feather. For you? She opened it. Inside, dried flowers, herbs, and something else, something faintly metallic. A brooch. Her husband's brooch. She looked up, confused. I buried him, Nokone said. Your soldier. I found him long before the boy. I did not know you were his. The breath left her body. You found him? She whispered. He nodded. I buried him as warrior. Under a sky that does not forget. Tears slid down her cheeks. Not grief. Not this time. Something else. Closure. Nokoni stepped back. When they come for the child, will you give him? Yes, she said, but not without saying goodbye. He nodded and left her standing in the doorway. The bundle held against her chest. 3 days passed. Then they came quiet and solemn. 3 Comanche riders, and with them, a woman whose eyes were carved from storm. The grandmother. Clara held little Feather one last time, pressing her lips to his brow, whispering something only he would ever hear. When she handed him to the woman, the baby grabbed her finger, held tight, then let go. The riders turned to leave. Nokani stayed behind. He looked at Clara, then spoke. This time, in English. There is no word for thank you big enough. He placed a hand over her heart. Strong heart. She nodded, blinking fast. You'll raise him well. I'll watch, he said. Always. And then he was gone. Spring unfurled slowly. The cabin felt large without the weight of small breath inside it. Clara planted a garden, hung herbs in the window. The wind warmed, and every year, on the first day of thaw, she found a pouch of herbs on her windowsill, always fresh, always silent. Sometimes she stood at the tree line, just to feel the space he might still fill. She never saw him again, but she never felt unseen. Because some acts change more than a life. They change a soul, and the land remembers always.